Okay, Ramon, we are witnessing a historic event of which the implications are yet to be seen in the coming years, which is the rapid fall of Kabul. And I would like to discuss two topics with you. One is how to explain the events in Afghanistan, because a lot of the Western media pundits are baffled. They don't understand how it is possible. The planning of the Americans were that they would withdraw. The Afghans would fight for themselves for maybe another year or have talks with them. And on 11th of September, Biden would declare, look, uh, we have won, we killed bin Laden, and we are out of Afghanistan. And see what's there. Now, long before that time, Taliban took over. So what would they do on the 11th of September? Expecting that the mess in Afghanistan would continue, and now it's the reverse. The Taliban took province capital day by day, and with astonishing speed, and so the narrative is that obviously evil has come to power, where evil is the Taliban and the good are the Western powers. Now, to understand uh, the victory of the Taliban and to explain the victory of the Taliban, I think we need to look at the nature of the Taliban and the narrative about the Taliban. When the Taliban came to power in 1996, after fighting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1978, Afghanistan was a communist-led country, led by a communist party after coup d'état, supported by the Soviet Union, and then went through internal strife and not able to manage the country. The Soviet invaded with the army to pop up the regime, and then the United States, organized support uh, for the resistance against the Soviet invasion, which led to the Taliban coming into power in 1996, and then suddenly you see an extremist Islamic group that introduces an Islamic government system, which was brutal in every respect, and that lasted 5 years, till from 1996 to 2001, when the United States, with the help of the Europeans, invaded uh, Afghanistan. Now, how is it possible for the world strongest military power, economic power, politically power, how is it possible that they lose against a group of people who apparently in their narrative are extremely unpopular in Afghanistan, have no popular base whatsoever, uh, and yet city after city fell in Afghanistan without any resistance. So if you take up this racist, orientalist view of how they look at Afghanistan and Western Asia, where Islamic barbarism is on the rise, you won't be able to understand it. But if you look at it from the perspective of how in these countries popular forces organize against imperial invasion, Western invasion, in different parts of Western Asia, the so-called Middle East, uh, and you see it as a popular struggle against foreign invasion, then suddenly it's not only just a simple matter of evil versus good, which good is Western and evil is Orientalist. Um, and the idea that uh, the Taliban might have changed, which they argue in the last few days. The spokesmen of the Taliban are making clear that they are deviating from the policies of 1996. So if you don't accept that transformation is possible, then obviously you're lost, because you can't understand how it is possible that this occurred. Now, our good friend Masood Shadare of the Islamic Human Rights Commission, brought my attention to a video which you can find on YouTube, where a commander of the Taliban goes to a Shia village. And in this Shia village, he explains the policy of the Taliban on how to create a new Afghanistan. Mind you, when the Taliban was in power, they were extremely sectarian towards the Sikhs, other religious groups, other ethnic groups, and especially also against the Shia. But in this particular video, this guy explains to the villagers that their struggle is a national liberation struggle. A national liberation struggle where unity of all the Afghans are of extreme importance. And in that unity, they have a policy where revenge, which was rampant in the earlier period, was out of the agenda. So they wanted every Afghan who worked for the NATO forces to be assured for their safety and their security and their ability to live in another Afghanistan. He made explicit his opposition against the ISIS policy in the Shia-Sunni question, which was divide and fight the Muslims among each other. He explained that when the soldiers surrendered, they got medical care and even got payment to travel to their families back without any bloodshed. So the way they achieved this victory so fast and so is because of the policy of trying to convert the previous radical sectarian struggle into a national liberation struggle. And that explains, if you take that as a perspective, you can understand where the national liberation struggle, which takes the form of a guerrilla war, we have the manuals of Che Guevara and Mao Zedong on how the guerrilla can only survive with popular support. The idea that the Taliban might have popular support is mind-blowing in the West. They just can't accept that. But because of that popular support, where people want peace and prosperity, and this guy in the video I mentioned also the aim of the national liberation struggle, which is economic prosperity and education. He mentioned those two aspects. And mind you, this guy is not a high-ranking Taliban official. It's just one of the local commanders. So apparently within the Taliban, a transformation has taken place, and we'll have to see if the transformation is permanent and it is stable. It might disintegrate. There are all kinds of uncertainties here, so we are not sure whether this will last. But transforming the sectarian group into an organization of national liberation can explain why the first mightiest power fell in Afghanistan. Once you take the idea that it is impossible for them to have popular support, you just can't explain how it was possible for them to win this war and bring back the remnants of the Vietnam War, where a popular revolution had beaten the world's first military power. Now, so if you take the idea of the transformation, and we have to see whether this transformation is stable and long-lasting, of a sectarian group into a national liberation movement, if that transformation will continue, then the the meaning of the fall of Kabul will go well beyond Afghanistan. If, in fact, already now, if you look at the implications of the way the Americans were beaten in Afghanistan, you look at it internationally and regionally, it's mind-blowing. Let's first look into the impact on Taiwan. Taiwan is, in the eyes of the Chinese mainland, a province which belongs to China and should be reunited with China. And when the Taliban took over, the Chinese media were saying to the Taiwanese, you've seen what happened there? The Americans are not going to risk another war. They are wary of war. The people of the US are wary of war. The military of the US are wary of war. So, if there is an action by the Chinese to invade Taiwan, don't expect the US to come to your help. And the way they explain it is, they said, look, we can take Taiwan in matters of hours. We have all the plans there. We can bomb your military and hardware and your military infrastructure, invade it, and bring Taiwan under China mainland control within a day. And the reason they are not doing it is that they prefer to have the unification in a peaceful manner. But now that the United States has provided Taiwan with weapons in so-called defense, the Chinese have reacted and said, if you're going into this provocative way, then an invasion is not unthinkable. And the Kabul messages, really the American won't risk a war to defend you, Taiwan, because the people of America would say, let the Chinese deal with their own mess, we are not going there. The second impact is this. The leadership of Hamas sent a message to the Taliban, congratulating them and telling them, what you have done with the Americans have shown that even the mightiest power, and Israel is the sixth mightiest power, not the first one. What you have done with the Americans, we can do with the, what you have done with the Americans, we can do with the Israelis. So be sure that the future, where at one point in time there was no idea within the liberation movement of the where there's a fantasy that the apartheid state of Israel could be overcome, could be defeated. And they are saying now, based on the last war between the resistance in Gaza and the Israelis, based on that last war, they have the estimation that within a generation time, Israel could be defeated militarily. And the way they would be defeated militarily is that they would take the battle in Israel itself, where the resistance fighters will come into Tel Aviv and into Israel, which until now was an unthinkable strategy. So the way Kabul fell is now bringing to the fore that the mightiest imperial powers can be defeated. And then, obviously, the whole Western Asia geopolitics of now, the whole Western Asia was, in one sense, focused on a possible war between the West and Iran, where initially the GCPOA was, the nuclear agreement was a kind of instrument to contain Iran. Uh, 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 the Israelis for decades now are calling on the United States to engage in a war with Iran. Um, what this shows is the United States is going to leave Western Asia. It's going to leave Iraq, which they are doing now. They have military bases there. They're not going into a confrontation with Iran. And sooner or later, Israel is the one that's going to be isolated, and the regimes that support Israel can come in big troubles. So we see that the fall of Kabul brings into play a lot of uh, uh, factors which are showing us how the decline of American empire is not an accident. It's part of this larger picture of the final hours of the American empire, and for that matter of the Western empire. And the defeat militarily in Afghanistan will be followed by economic defeats and political defeats and a restructuring of the world order in which Russia and China will be pivotal. And Afghanistan will show the example of how they will be pivotal. First of all, just economically, first of all, just politically, because in the discussions with the Taliban, the Chinese and the Russians, and for that matter, all the other neighbors, want the assurance that Afghanistan will not support the Al Qaeda type of movements that they used to support. For Russia, obviously, it was Chechnya. For China, it was Xinjiang province, where they supported terrorist groups around the Uyghurs. And if they can come to an understanding that these powers will provide economic support of rebuilding Afghanistan so that a long-lasting peace might be there, the neutralization of Afghanistan as a center for Al-Qaeda type of organizations to be operating, training, and conducting missions outside of Afghanistan, you might see a new chapter opening in the history of Western Asia and therefore in the history of the world. So the assessment, my assessment of the fall of Kabul is basically a positive one. It's one that says the defeat of the American empire is opening this new chapter in world history that we should compare with, for example, the fall of Portuguese and Spanish Empire. I used to make this comparison that if you were let's say an indigenous person living in Mexico in the 17th century, you can't imagine if somebody would tell you one day Spain will not be an imperial power. You can't imagine that Spain couldn't be an imperial power, because that is what you were accustomed for generations to hear. Now, if you would ask me who's the president of Spain, I have to look it up. Spain is not associated anymore with the imperial power of the world. In 50 years' times, the United States of America, if somebody would ask who's the president, you might not know. You might have to look it up, because the power of the United States is not that imperial power anymore. It's just another regular country in the world. And the fall of Kabul has signaled just that. So I'll leave it for the moment there.
Thank you, Du. This is very interesting and important what you're saying. basically the war historical significance of the fall of Kabul for the empire is, or the victory of Afghans and taking over Kabul, is going to have, it's going to send a wave of domino kind of effect to the world, because as you well described, it has a lot of consequences worldwide, because it shows how the US empire cannot beat up with all their weapons, with all their technology, with all the, you know, advanced military strategies and technology and so on. They cannot beat up guerrilla warfare that are comparatively, in technologically speaking, you know, much more, you know, underdeveloped. Because the main thing is not the technology of weapons. The main thing is the people. That shows something very old that we all know, but we sometimes forget, which is that what decides any event in terms of warfare is the heart of the people. Where is the heart of the people? The Americans never had the heart of the people in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, anywhere they go. That's why they end up losing wars. And but we need to, in a sense, there is a period there that I want to clarify in your narrative, which is the time between the fall of the Soviet Union and Afghanistan and the time the Taliban came to power. That period is not as if there was the fall of Soviet Union and then came the Taliban. That's not how it worked. Mm-hmm. There were several years there between the fall of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. When they left, they were defeated. We need to remember that the Afghans, like the Vietnamese, have defeated many empires in their soil. They defeated the British, they defeated the Soviets, and now they defeated the Americans. And the Americans always come late to the game, you know, and they should learn the lesson. That's the same thing with Vietnam. Vietnam defeated the Japanese, then defeated the French, and then came the Americans in the last moment, and then they were defeated too. I mean, the Americans always come late without a knowledge of history, without a knowledge, with arrogance, and that's why they end up where they end up, in these disasters, military disasters, because, you know, if you go to Vietnam or Afghanistan, you have to know where you're going. And these people are warriors. These people are warriors for a long time. And so you're not going to just any place in the world. You're going to one of the, you know, places in the world where the people are well prepared to fight any mighty, you know, any empire. They will go after it, and they have a long-term vision. They're not, in a sense, you know, collapsing just because they invaded. They organize themselves and they go slowly, you know, battle after battle, struggle after struggle, until they beat empires, you know. And this is in history, you can see 3 times in Vietnam, and you can see now 3 times in Afghanistan. So the Americans basically intervene to take out what they call the evil empire, the Soviet Union. In the middle of the Cold War, they basically organized the network that in the CIA files called Al-Qaeda. You know, this is, people doesn't know that much about it, but Al-Qaeda was a creation of the CIA from the beginning to fight the evil empire. Bin Laden was involved in the organization of that international network to go to Afghanistan, get jihadists there to fight the Soviet Union. But then when the Soviet Union fell, there was a civil war because there were many factions fighting for power in Afghanistan. With the backing of power, with the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a backing of power. And all these factions that were fighting together against the Soviet Union suddenly take it against each other. They took it against each other. And then they start fighting each other. There was a civil war. Who are the Taliban? The Taliban Taliban means student. And who are the Taliban? The Taliban are the orphans of the war, of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that were reorganized in Pakistan in madrasas, in Islamic schools by the Saudis, Saudi Arabia, with its extremist Wahhabi version of Islam, which is very, very ideological, very, very, I mean, it's basically, Wahhabism is basically, I always say, it's basically a colonization of British Christian fundamentalists, Protestant fundamentalists of that part of the world, because what the Wahhabis do is just imitate the methods of reading the Bible of the Protestant Christian fundamentalists from Britain and apply it to the Quran. And, you know, they read the Quran in the same way, in a dogmatic, literal way. And so they become, it's a very extremist ideology, and they take other Muslims as their main enemy, which is why the British Empire, since the 18th century, starts supporting them, because suddenly you have a group in the Islamic world that takes other Muslims as their enemies. So for the British Empire, was like, wow, this is great. You know, you have here a group fighting Muslims, not fighting empires. And so, so the British were supporting them to destroy the Ottomans, right? The Wahhabis. Now, in the contemporary moment, these Taliban were in the middle of the civil war, that there was devastation in Afghanistan. There was the West, you know, together, of course, with the Saudis, organized these students in the madrasas into militias and send them into the civil war to put order in Afghanistan. They gave them weapons, they trained them, they gave them everything they could with this conservative reactionary version of Islam called Wahhabism, which is a recent thing in the Islamic world. It's a 200-year ideology. It's not it's not something that 200 at the most, 250 years, something like that. It's not something that it has been there in Islamic civilization. It's a modern thing that that has been encouraged and supported and financed and militarized by the British Empire and later the Americans. You know, that's why the Saudis are on bet with the Americans and with the British and with everybody in the West. And and so what happened then is that they organized these students from the madrasas, who were the orphans of the war, into militias, give them weapons, train them, send them to the civil war to put order. And they basically took power, you know, over the other factions. So it was, look, and also the Pakistan intelligence was involved in that, of course, but this was all an imperial plan. So at the beginning, you have that Taliban of the 90s with that extreme version of Islam that we saw. It's a Wahhabi Saudi Arabia ideology. That's why they don't allow women, they didn't allow women to, you know, to drive a car or to, I mean, it's the same thing that happened in Saudi Arabia, but nobody in the press say anything about this about Saudi Arabia. You see what I mean? Because Saudi Arabia is an ally of US, it's an ally of the Zionists, it's part of the equation of, you know, destroying the resistance in the Middle East and elsewhere. So nobody talks about it. But in fact, the Taliban of the 90s was that version of Islam that was promoted by the Saudis and the Americans. The Americans were okay with all of that, you know, and because they thought that once the Taliban took power, then they will do like the Saudis. They will give up the country to the American corporation. This is what the Americans were betting at, you know. So this hypocrisy about, oh, women's rights, all this stuff, you know, that happened in the 90s of the West and using it as an excuse to invade Afghanistan is really a hypocrisy, because if there was a country responsible for getting that group with that extremist ideology into power, was the US Empire. And what happened was, to their surprise, that the Taliban did not go along with the plans of giving up their land for US transnational corporations, especially gas pipes coming from the north, crossing Afghanistan into the Indian Ocean. Those pipes they refused to accept this, the Taliban, you know, and and that's why they enter in trouble with the Americans. That was it. If they would have given up all their resources, like the Saudis, all the resources of Afghanistan to the Americans, there won't have been an invasion. They would be celebrating the Taliban's in power like they do with the Saudis. They will be on bed with them. The only reason that didn't happen was because the Taliban refused to give up on Americans' exploitation of their country. And so this, so we need to go back to that history to understand where is this coming from, because many people that do not know the history might think, oh, this is something about cultural, about the Afghans, and it's not true. This is a militia organized from Pakistan, thrown to the civil war to put order, take power, and put everything in the hands of the Americans. But that didn't work the way the Americans wanted. That was it, And then, of course, the Americans invaded. The first thing they do is put the pipelines they wanted, gas pipelines to crossing over the territory. But the other thing they did was to bring back something the Taliban have eradicated, the export of the flour used for heroin, which I forget now the name, but in English. Opium. But anyway, I'm sorry?
Opium plants.
Yeah, opium plants, all these plants are suddenly, with the American invasion, then the warlords took power again regionally in different parts of the country, doing atrocities. No woman liberation like the Americans promised. On the contrary, they were being bombed, killed, you name it, raped by these, private war lords of Afghanistan. Then the flourishing of drug industry went, escalated, because then the opium was, they start producing opium massively with the consent of the American empire, American militarism. We need to remember that the same thing happened when the US invaded Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And there was in that triangle of the frontier between these three countries, the CIA controlled that area, and they have the largest exportation of opium to the world to produce all kinds of things, including heroin, And so, and this is the same thing that happened when they invaded Afghanistan. So the corruption, the atrocities, the arbitrariness of power, the raping of women, the killings, massive killings of Afghans, because the Americans used Afghanistan as a laboratory for their so-called advanced weapons. And there were bombs that were thrown massively in Afghanistan, in the countryside, that were destroying whole mountains, because these were bombs that was, that weighted like tons of, of kilos or pounds, and they were thrown that make a crater, because they were used to precisely go into the caves below the mountains, because the theory was that Al-Qaeda was hiding in caves, and these were new bombs that will go, I don't know how many hundreds of meters down the mountain, into the subterranean area of the soil. And so they created craters. They destroy a lot of, the landscape, but also people. They kill a lot of people and torture people, you name it, the corruption. Listen, the Americans knew very well that 10% of the money they were spending in Afghanistan for militarism was going to the Taliban. Why? Because a lot of these military industrial complex that were doing business with the war in Afghanistan, they have to pay the Taliban in order to be able to pass certain roads, and they were paying a fee to the Taliban in order to get to some places with their weapons or whatever. So it was a corrupt system from the beginning. And talking about military industrial complex, we need to understand that the logic of the invasion of Afghanistan is not so much the gas pipes, you know, that they were using, or turning the economy into a, you know, into a drug export economy. The main thing, or the main interest pushing for the invasion, was military-industrial complex. That is, we need to understand that the military-industrial complex of the USA live off taxpayers' money. So if, in the only way they can make a lot of money is by inventing wars. If there's no war, they manufacture a war, because they need to have a justification to get the budget of the Defense Department growing significantly, to get all this money into contracts for their companies. And that's how they made their money. So this is like a self-destructive system. President Eisenhower, last day in his office, he has a famous speech that you can see online in YouTube, where he talks about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. And he mentioned how it's going to destroy American democracy, the American government, the American, I mean, he goes on and on. And this is General Eisenhower, the guy who manufactured the Cold War, the guy of the military-industrial complex, who knew very well how it works. This guy, it was like a moment of like, okay, this is my last day in office. I have nothing to lose. I'm going to say something sincere to the American public my last day. Then he went on and started calling attention to how destructive this will be. And that's exactly what happened in the USA. The US empire has been destroyed from within by military-industrial complex. This is a war economy. They need wars, even if they know they're going to lose the war, but it doesn't matter, because they want to push for a war in order to make money. So they made money during 20 years, trillions of dollars invested in Iraq and Afghanistan, trillions with a T. That's part of the debt that the US federal government has today. The $28 trillion of debt that US government has today, a portion of that is the trillions of dollars in these crazy wars that they knew from the beginning they were not going to win. But they went on because this military-industrial complex wants war to make money. That's as simple as that. And they're a very powerful lobby in Washington that pays for the campaign of all politicians, Democrats and Republicans. So that's why every time there is a vote for war in the Congress, they have almost unanimous decision saying yes to war, because they are paid in their campaign, so they're bought off. It's a corrupt system. And so this is what we're seeing, how the US empire is being destroyed also from within, not only from the struggles of people fighting these wars, but also from within, because the interest of military-industrial complex is not the long-term interest of the empire. They don't care if the empire goes down, they want money tonight. And if there is a war, even if they know they're not going to win it, but if they can create a war tonight, they go for that war, even if it's going to be damaging in the long term for US empire, because that war will give them billions, trillions of dollars in profits tonight, not in 50 years. So they don't care about the long-term interest of the empire. This is a contradiction inside the US empire between the people who are trying to save the empire in the long term and the military-industrial complex who doesn't care. They just want money tonight. They don't care if these wars are going to lead them to disaster, And so coming back to what happened, the war historical significance of the defeat of the empire in Afghanistan is huge. It's going to have the same effect as the Vietnam, war, the defeat of empire in Vietnam, but probably even more than Vietnam, because now we're talking about a moment of declining of US empire and a moment of where the empire existence itself is at stake. And we know it's going down. We know it's going to disappear, as you said. We don't know when or how. It could be disastrous. We don't know what will be the way it will fall. It can fall trying to, take the war with it down or whatever. This is a very dangerous moment, because in moments like that, you could get crazy stuff happening in the hands of empires falling, But anyway, so Now, the Taliban of today, and this is what you were describing, the Taliban of today seems not to be the Taliban of the 1990s. Taliban of today seem to be a group that is not anymore playing in the hands of the Saudis or of the Wahhabi ideology, but seems to be like a coalition of forces. Taliban now is not the old Wahhabi, students from coming, from Pakistan. This is now.
Remember, Ramon, that their headquarters is not in Saudi Arabia but in Qatar. And
Yes.
you know that Qatar and Saudi Arabia are in a long-standing conflict. You know?
Of course.
So you're right on that, and the whole strategy of the Taliban now should be seen that more than ever they take geopolitics into account, not
Yes.
just Islamic things.
Of course, they're taking geopolitics. They're taking also the like you said, they're thinking as a national liberation movement, not anymore like a sectarian group, and they're opening to dialogue with the Shias, with other versions of Islam, as brothers and sisters. They're opening to it's not the sectarian group that was there in the 90s. It's not anymore. Look, the way they won this war so fast in the last few months was amazing. And it has to do with also a change in their policy.
Sure.
They followed the example of Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad, when his forces beat up the enemy, especially Mecca, everybody thought there was going to be a slaughter. That now the Muhammad's military force were going to kill everybody. No, he came in and pardoned everybody, gave amnesty to everybody, to the surprise of everybody. Okay, so he pardoned everybody, all his enemies, and that's how a lot of his enemies then embraced Islam because they saw something different, And if their enemies would have beat up the forces of Muhammad, they would have killed everybody, including Muhammad. But Muhammad won the war and pardoned everybody. Okay, same thing with Saladin in several hundred years later with the Crusade Wars, when he took over Jerusalem, he pardoned everybody, and there was peace, And it looks as if the Taliban are doing the same. What they did was, and that's how the whole thing falls so fast. A 300,000 army led by the Americans there disappeared, evaporated in 2 months. How? Because everywhere they went, they offered amnesty to and pardon all the military forces of pro-American Afghan government army, and pardon, including the generals, including people who have made atrocities or did very bad things against them. They pardoned them. So they took, as long as they gave their weapons, they could go home. So all these soldiers that were tired of war, that were now put in a very difficult situation, to have to fight, with their own people, etc. They just gave up their weapons and went home, which is a very different approach from the Taliban in the 90s, because in the 90s.
Brother Masood told me an interesting incident where now is currently the first month of the Islamic calendar, Muharram, and where the Shia, I think it was in Kabul, celebrated Muharram by putting their flags out. And then some Taliban came and took the flags and put them down. And a day or two later, they came back with their commander, who apologized to the Shia for doing this, put up the flag again, and assured them for the security and safety. What you see there, that within the Taliban structure, there may be a lot of there may be rank and file who took their own line in deciding what to do, but they are disciplined. by the structures that are there. So that tells you that this chaotic, loose bundle of extremist soldiers which were there 20 years ago is a totally different new organization. You see,
Yes.
and if you don't see that, you don't understand how an incident like this, for example, could happen. You in the Western press probably they would report on the bringing down of the flags, but they wouldn't report on the apologies and putting up the flags again. You see,
Yes.
and that's why the Western media, because of the totally biased reporting, cannot let you understand what's going on in Afghanistan. You see, and
But
now,
dude, there is something
yeah,
that also the Western media haven't reported over the years, which is that the Taliban control the whole country except Kabul and a
yes,
few cities.
yes, yes,
The whole country for years have been under control of
yes,
Taliban.
yes,
So the people have seen that this is a different Taliban from the
right,
past.
right,
Okay, it might not be, we might criticize many things of their policy. Maybe,
right,
socially speaking, maybe they haven't. Although they are promising that they will have different policies toward women, etc. I don't know. We need to see if that's true or
right,
not, or that will be real or not. Because as you remember, they were very extreme. They were following the Saudis' version of
yes,
Wahhabism,
yes, yes,
which put women, in closets,
right,
and that kind of thing, and so, but now they were, I seen some declaration of Taliban officials saying that they're going to have a different policy. Let's see if they deliver on that. But so far, what it looks like as if they have broken with this sectarian ideology of Wahhabism, and they're now thinking as a national liberation movement. They're now thinking of the unity of the country.
right,
They're now thinking of stopping the sectarianism and wars. People are tired of that. They don't want to go back to a civil war. They want to stop that possibility from happening, because this is exactly what happened when they defeat the Soviets. They merely a civil war. Why? Because there were factions fighting for power. And now the Taliban are saying, hey, we should get together and we should run this country together instead of fighting for who is going to run the country and get another civil war. So suddenly they learned the lesson from the past, and suddenly you have something different happening. Let's see if that lasts.
yes,
Because as you said, the situation is chaotic. There might be still faction of I know there are for a fact some factions that still hold to the Wahhabi
sure,
ideology that are there, but it doesn't seem as if they have the
upper hand,
power they have before, or the leadership they have before. It looks like more as a marginal group rather than a main group of the Taliban. So this is a major change and development. And look,
there's
20
another,
years of US invasion led them to self-criticize and to transform their way of thinking and their way of acting with people, etc. And so that's the formula for their success.
yeah,
Everywhere they were running in the country, for the last year, because they were running the whole country except Kabul and a few cities. The people were, they were in general supporting them because they were respecting agreements. They were respecting different versions of Islam. They were not killing, they took distance from ISIS, from Al Qaeda, from all these terrorist groups fabricated by the Americans. They took distance from all of this, and now they're moving in a completely different direction, which is, I would say, very encouraging and interesting. But that's what the West cannot see with their Orientalism, because part of Orientalism, part of the racism of Orientalism is not to recognize the political agency of the colonized people. They always try to, whatever agency is there, they always try to essentialize it by saying, it's this, they're doing this because they are terrorists or because they are savages, or because, no, and they cannot see that these are human beings fighting for their best interests.
and the capacity to learn and to transform.
Exactly.
They think these are ossified, sterile, backward things with no capability of thinking about the future, about
Right.
taking steps on.
With no political agency. Everything is about some essentialistic, ancient culture and ancient attitude or whatever, which doesn't allow the West to see that these are people who are acting politically and are able to transform, change, act, struggle, resist, and change their views in the process, etc. I mean, they cannot see that, because for them, these people are inferior beings who are have some atavic, ancient, cultural, or biological inferiority.
Yeah.
This is the problem.
Yeah. There's another interesting thing, I think, that when you look on how they emphasize now the future, and that was very instructive in this video of the village meeting between the Taliban commander and the Shia community. He pictured a kind of future of Afghanistan, one, there's a future without war, where people live in peace. Now, we imagine that the future living in peace is possible because we don't have a war here. But if Afghanistan, where they have been having wars for 40 years, for them, the prospect of peace is something they have to realize, but it's very urgent for them. They want peace. The majority of the Afghans are sick of war, like the majority of the Americans are sick of war. So the prospect of peace is there, and suddenly it is possible if they unite. That's what the guy was saying. If we unite, we can achieve peace. But the second thing is, which he mentioned, is economic prosperity. He says if we have peace, we can be prosperous. We can develop our economy, our infrastructure. We can have food on the table. People can come out of poverty, have a decent living. And the line of the Chinese is exactly that. You fight underdevelopment by building infrastructure, not by development aid, by building infrastructure, and from infrastructure, building the economy and bringing people out of poverty. And the third thing the guy said was important is education. He said you can only achieve economic prosperity if you have an educated people. You see, so he urged people to stay, to get educated. And who is telling me that only men will get educated? Because you will need a woman in the long term. So I think the fall of Kabul, which is now painted as the darkest period in the history of Afghanistan, may be the beginning of a new prosperous period in the history of Afghanistan because of the defeat of the empire, and therefore also in Western Asia, because if this will lead to the withdrawal of the Americans from the rest of Western Asia, which was the vision of General Soleimani of Iran, and he organized all these groups against ISIS and against the US and Zionist empire. If that is what's going to happen in the coming years in Western Asia, then the fall of Kabul will have a major historical impact, you see. So I think, contrary to the narrative in the Western press, where the future of Afghanistan is now pictured in the darkest terms ever possible, from a decolonial perspective, I come to another conclusion. This is a marvelous period in world history. It can be a marvelous period in world history if it goes along the line of acknowledging the transformation that has been going on for the past 20 years within the Taliban, from the sectarian movement to the national liberation movement, and the prospect of a long-lasting peace in Afghanistan, which will change the history of Afghanistan, and therefore also so it's a positive evaluation rather than what's now going on in the Western press, a horrible evaluation of what's going on.
I think that this negotiation they're doing now with all the different ethnic groups, different religious groups in Afghanistan is the way out of avoiding a civil war. That's why they're sitting down with everybody and try to negotiate a deal where everybody is happy and where they don't go back to a situation like happened with the fall of the Soviets, that then they start fighting each other again. Yes. And this is a great thing, what they're doing now, to avoid civil war. For that, they have to think of themselves as a national liberation movement, and they have to stop the sectarianism. And this is what is the new thing emerging, to the surprise of everybody, because nobody expected the Taliban to grow and mature in this way. everybody was thinking of the Taliban as some kind of, sectarian, crazy group of the 90s, and forgot that they've been 20 years since then, and they learned the lesson. And now the people running the Taliban is like there are many groups there living together, negotiating their differences in an intelligent way, and this gives hopes to the future.
Okay, great, Ramon. Thank you very much. Another pleasant conversation with analysis of current affairs. We'll talk again. Take care, man.
Okay, take care.
Bye.